a quiet archive record. Tonight, we step beyond the noise, into a place where nothing asks anything of you. Let the world loosen its grip and gently fade from view. On a late-night drive in 1961, two ordinary people said they saw something they could not explain. What followed became one of the most famous alien abduction claims in modern history. This episode carefully reconstructs the Betty and Barney Hill case, using the timeline, the key statements, and the way the story changed across interviews, reports, and hypnosis sessions. We will separate what is documented from what is inferred, and we will place the case inside its real historical context: Cold War anxiety, the early UFO era, and the rise of public fascination with space. Tonight, we go through the Betty and Barney Hill case. Betty and Barney Hill were not celebrities when their story began. They were a married couple living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were active in their community. They were also an interracial couple at a time when that carried social pressure. Barney was black, Betty was white. They worked regular jobs. They had families. They took trips the way many couples do, to visit friends and to get away for a few days. In September 1961, they drove to Montreal for a vacation. On the way back, they traveled south through rural areas at night. The roads were darker then. There were fewer cars. There were fewer bright signs and lights. That kind of drive can feel long and hypnotic. It can also heighten attention. When you are on a long night drive, you watch the road and you watch the sky, because the sky is visible and there is less to distract you. The heart of the case is the drive home, on the night of September 19 into September 20th, 1961. At some point, they noticed a bright light in the sky. Betty later described it as a star that seemed to move. They pulled over. They used binoculars. They drove again. They pulled over again. The light seemed to be following them, or at least staying with them as they moved. This part is important because it is not rare to see a bright point in the sky that appears to move relative to you, especially when you are in a moving vehicle on a winding road. A bright planet, a bright star, a plane with lights, or even a satellite can appear to shift position as your perspective changes. But the Hills were not just noting a distant light. They said it changed behavior. They said it got closer. They said it seemed to respond. As the night continued, they described the light as becoming more like an object. In some accounts, it took on a shape. In some accounts, it seemed to hover. They described it as large. They described it as moving in ways they did not expect from normal aircraft. At one point, Barney got out of the car and looked through binoculars. In later tellings, this moment becomes dramatic. Barney said he could see windows. He said he could see figures. He said he felt fear. That detail matters because it becomes part of how the case is judged. If Barney truly thought he saw figures through binoculars, that implies either a very close object or a strong misinterpretation of light and pattern. In night viewing, binoculars can create illusions. Bright objects can bloom. Contrast can be misleading. Movement can be misread. But people also can sometimes identify aircraft details under the right conditions. The Hills did not claim to be trained aviation observers. They were regular people. That can cut both ways. A skeptic can say they lacked expertise. A believer can say they had no reason to invent. After that, the story shifts into the part that made the case famous. They reported hearing a series of beeping or buzzing sounds. In many accounts, the sound happened twice. Then, they said, there was a gap in time. They arrived home later than expected. They felt strange. Their clothes were dirty. Their shoes were scuffed. Their watches were not working properly in some tellings. They had a sense that something happened that they could not remember clearly. This is the core of the claim of missing time. Missing time is often used in abduction narratives. People say they experienced an interruption, a blank period, and then returned. But missing time can also occur in ordinary ways. A couple can stop for longer than they realize. A driver can take a wrong turn. Fatigue can distort memory. Stress can distort time sense. Still, the Hills felt strongly that the missing time was real. In the days after the drive, Betty began to have vivid dreams. In her dreams, she described being taken aboard a craft. She described beings. She described a medical examination. She described conversations. These dreams became detailed and repeated. This part is crucial for understanding the case. Some of the details that later became central appeared first in dreams. Dreams are not evidence of an external event. Dreams are evidence of an internal experience. Dreams can reflect fear, fascination, and recent events. They can also incorporate cultural images. In the early 1960s, the cultural image of space visitors was forming. Science fiction films existed. Magazine stories existed. Newspaper UFO stories existed. People talked about flying saucers. People talked about visitors. The Hills were living in that world. At the same time, the Hills did not immediately go public as entertainers. Betty talked with some people. She wrote letters. They reported the sighting to the Air Force at one point. They contacted the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, a civilian UFO group. They also spoke with a local investigator. Over time, their stress continued. Barney had anxiety. He had physical symptoms. He had nightmares. They sought help. They eventually met a psychiatrist named Benjamin Simon in Boston. Simon was known for treating trauma. He had experience with hypnosis. Hypnosis was used more commonly then as a clinical tool. This is where the case shifts again. Under hypnosis, in 1964, Betty and Barney separately described an abduction scenario. They described being taken into a craft. They described beings. They described examinations. They described details like a star map. These hypnosis sessions became the main source for the most dramatic claims. This is also where the modern debate begins. Supporters say hypnosis helped them recover memory. Skeptics say hypnosis can create false memories, and that it is especially risky when a person already has strong dreams or expectations. Modern psychology tends to treat hypnosis as unreliable for accurate memory recovery. People can become highly suggestible. They can confabulate. They can blend imagination with memory. But it is also true that people under hypnosis often feel their recalled scenes are real. The emotional intensity can be high. So the hypnosis content is meaningful, but not in the simple way that believers want. It might be a window into the Hills' fears and feelings, or it might be a mix of real experience and later interpretation. Or, if you accept the abduction claim, it might be their best attempt to describe something alien. A careful approach does not decide too quickly. We keep the timeline. We keep the sources. We separate what happened first from what was added later. Now we will rebuild the case step by step. First, the sighting itself. We can ask basic questions. What did they see? Where were they? What time was it? What were the possible normal objects in the sky? In 1961, there were also military aircraft and training routes. There were satellites. There were bright planets. Some researchers later suggested the hills might have misidentified Jupiter or another bright object. Others suggested they might have seen an aircraft, a meteor, or a combination. One challenge is that their description includes movement that seems responsive. A bright planet does not follow a car, but a perspective illusion can feel like that. If you drive on curving roads, a distant object can appear to stay in the same area of sky. It can appear to pace you. Now, Barney's binocular detail. If he really saw windows and figures, the object must have seemed closer. Could a plane at night look like a windowed craft? Some aircraft have rows of lights. Some aircraft have windows. But seeing figures is more difficult to explain. However, the brain is excellent at finding faces and forms. It will see patterns. In a stressed state, the mind will fill in. Now, the sound. They described beeping or buzzing. A car can make sounds on a road. Tires can hum. A mechanical issue can cause a repeating noise. But the hills tied the sound to the object. They said the sound seemed to come from outside. They said it was not normal. They said it was a trigger. After the sound, they said they were in a different place. That is missing time. Missing time is one of the strongest subjective markers in abduction cases. But missing time is not objective evidence without external records. We can ask whether their drive time, their known route, and their arrival time truly imply a gap. Some reconstructions suggest a gap of about 2 hours, but the exact numbers vary, and memory of departure and arrival times can be fuzzy. Now, the physical traces. Some tellings mention damaged clothing. Some mention marks on the car. Some mention magnetic compasses. Over the years, different investigators tested the car and found some shiny spots or marks, but those are not conclusive. Cars get marks, clothes get dirty, watches stop. The question is whether the total pattern is unusual. Now, the dreams. Betty's dreams began soon after. She wrote them down. They contained a story of beings and examinations. If nothing else, the dreams show she was strongly affected. They also may have provided a narrative framework that later influenced hypnosis. Now, the hypnosis sessions. Dr. Simon hypnotized them separately and asked them to recount the night. The tapes and notes show emotional distress. Barney especially showed fear. He described beings with large eyes. These descriptions later became part of the standard image of aliens, the so-called grey. But the Hill case was early enough that it may have influenced later cultural images. That raises a question. Did the case create the image, or did the image exist already? In the early 1960s, there were already science fiction images of big-eyed beings, but the Hill case helped fix the image in public consciousness. Now, the star map. Betty under hypnosis described being shown a map of stars. Later, years after, she drew a map. A researcher named Marjorie Fish tried to match the map to real star systems. Fish concluded it could match the Zeta Reticuli system, a pair of stars. This became famous. But the match is debated. The map is ambiguous. People can fit patterns. There are many stars. The human brain can see connections. Also, Betty had access to star charts and popular astronomy information. But supporters argue she was not trained and still produced a meaningful match. This is one of the most debated parts. Now we add the context that is often ignored. Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in 1961. They were in a world with real social threats. They were driving at night through rural areas. Barney in particular may have had reasons to feel unsafe. When we interpret his fear, we should remember that a sudden encounter with an unknown object, the feeling of being followed, the fear of being watched, could activate deeper fears. This does not explain the whole case, but it may explain the intensity. It also helps explain why the case became so psychologically powerful. Now, to keep this episode grounded, we will follow a simple rule. We will treat the earliest statements as more reliable than later additions. We will treat dreams and hypnosis as subjective data. We will treat physical traces as weak unless they are clearly unusual. And we will treat cultural context as a factor. With that rule, we can reconstruct a narrative that is both human and careful. The Hills are driving. They see a light. They become focused. They interpret it as following. They stop and look. They feel fear. They hear a sound. They later believe time is missing. They feel unsettled. Betty dreams. Barney has anxiety. They seek help. They undergo hypnosis. A detailed abduction story emerges. Now we ask the hard question. What is the simplest explanation that fits? One explanation is that they saw a normal object and misinterpreted it, and that their later stress and dreams and hypnosis created a full narrative. Another explanation is that they saw something unusual, perhaps an aircraft or other object, and that the missing time represents a real gap they could not account for. Another explanation is that they had a psychological event, like a dissociative episode, triggered by stress, and that hypnosis shaped it. And the most extreme explanation is that they were truly abducted. How do we rank these? We look at evidence. We look at mechanisms. We look at how often such events happen. We look at whether there are independent witnesses. In the Hill case, there were not clear independent witnesses to an abduction. There were some later claims by people who said they saw a light that night, but not a clear confirmation. There were no radar records that decisively confirm an object, as far as public record shows. So the strongest evidence is their testimony. Testimony can be sincere and still wrong, but testimony can also reflect something real. So we keep it in the middle. Now we will move through the story in a longer, more detailed way. We begin with the trip. They leave Montreal. They drive south. They pass through areas of New Hampshire. The night is clear enough to see stars. Betty is looking at the sky. She notices a bright light. At first, she thinks it is a star. Then it seems to move. Movement in the sky can be many things. A plane can move. A satellite can move. A meteor can move. A planet cannot move, but you can think it does if you are moving. Betty and Barney watch it. It seems to keep appearing when they look. That can feel like following. They talk about it. They become alert. Alertness can amplify perception. They pull over. They look through binoculars. This is important. Most people who see a strange light do not pull over and use binoculars. This suggests they were engaged and curious. It also suggests the sighting was not a split-second glimpse. They drive again. The light seems to move with them. They pull over again. At some point, they are near the White Mountains. The landscape is darker and more remote. Barney gets out. He looks. He later says he saw a craft. He later says he saw windows. He later says he saw figures. He feels fear. He feels an urgent need to leave. They get in the car. They drive. Then the sound happens. A series of beeps or buzzes. Then they are farther down the road. They do not recall the time in between. They get home. They feel strange. They sleep poorly. Betty has dreams. Barney has symptoms. They talk about it. Betty contacts authorities. They contact NICAP. They speak with an investigator. They write down what they remember. Then, later, they undergo hypnosis. Now we slow down and focus on sources. One key document is Betty's letter to NICAP. Another is the notes of early investigators. Another is Dr. Simon's hypnosis notes. Another is the later book that popularized the case. The case became widely known through a 1966 book by John G. Fuller, The Interrupted Journey. Fuller wrote it in a narrative style. The book shaped the public version. That means we must be careful. A narrative book can make events feel more certain than the sources support. It can also emphasize drama, so we prefer primary notes. Now, what did Dr. Simon believe? He did not conclude they were abducted. He leaned towards psychological explanations. He believed Betty's dreams influenced the hypnosis. He believed Barney's account was shaped by anxiety, but he also treated them as sincere. That is a key point. Many skeptics accuse abductees of lying. In the Hill case, the better view is that they likely believed their own story. Sincerity is not the same as accuracy. Now, the case also matters because it influenced later UFO culture. After the Hill case became famous, abduction stories increased. People began to report similar themes. That could mean the phenomenon spread, or it could mean a cultural template spread. Cultural templates are powerful. Once a story exists, people can reinterpret experiences through it. Now we can explore that mechanism. If you have a frightening night drive and see a strange light, and later hear about the hills, you might interpret your memory differently. If you have sleep paralysis and hear about abductions, you might interpret it as aliens. Sleep paralysis is a known phenomenon. It can include a feeling of presence. It can include vivid hallucinations. It can include a sense of being unable to move. Some abduction stories may be linked to sleep paralysis, but the Hill case began with a driving event, not a bedroom event, so the mechanism would be different. Still, the post-event dreams could have incorporated sleep-like experiences. Now we return to the missing time. Missing time could be explained by mundane stops, but the Hills seemed convinced. Why? One reason is that they had a strong emotional marker: the sound. A sudden sound can create a sense of transition. If they later found themselves farther down the road without a clear memory, it could feel like a blank. Memory is not continuous. It is reconstructed. During routine driving, people can drive on autopilot. They can later have poor memory of the period. This is common. But in the Hill case, the driving period was not routine. It was stressful. Stress can impair memory formation, so missing time is plausible as a psychological effect. Now, what about physical evidence? Some people later pointed to circular marks on the car. Some pointed to shiny spots. Some pointed to torn clothing. But these were not documented in a strong chain of custody. No forensic lab confirmed a unique residue. No official investigation confirmed an extraordinary trace. So physical evidence is weak. Now, what about the star map? The star map is interesting because it is specific, but it is also ambiguous. People can match it in multiple ways. This is a known problem called pattern matching. If you draw a set of points and lines, someone can find a match in a star catalogue. The question is whether the match is statistically meaningful. It is hard to prove, so we treat it as suggestive, not decisive. Now, another often discussed detail is that Betty and Barney's abduction accounts under hypnosis were not identical. They differed in some ways. Supporters say that proves independent memory. Skeptics say that is what you expect in confabulation. Different people will fill gaps differently. Also, they influenced each other over time. Even if hypnosis sessions were separate, they lived together. They talked. So independence is limited. Now, to make this episode satisfying, we will not just list uncertainties. We will explore the best arguments on each side. First, the believer argument. The Hills were ordinary. They reported a strange object. They experienced missing time. They had consistent distress. They did not seek fame at first. They underwent hypnosis and produced a detailed account. Some details, like the star map, seem oddly specific. Therefore, something happened. Second, the skeptic argument. Night sky misidentification is common. Perspective illusions make objects seem to follow. Stress and fatigue distort memory. Missing time can occur during routine driving. Betty's dreams created a narrative. Hypnosis is suggestive and unreliable. The abduction story reflects cultural themes. Physical evidence is weak. Therefore, no abduction is needed. Now, a balanced view. The Hills likely saw something they could not easily identify. It might have been an aircraft or a bright object. They became frightened. Their memories of time may have been distorted. Their later dreams and hypnosis likely created a more elaborate story. But the case remains influential because it shows how an event can grow into a cultural archetype. Now, we add one more dimension: media. After the story became public, it was adapted into TV. It became part of the UFO conversation. That feedback loop can reinforce memory. When your story becomes famous, you may begin to remember it in the form that people repeat. This can happen without lying. Memory is not a recording. 'Tis a story the brain tells. Now we step into the long, detailed account. We will begin with their lives. Betty was interested in UFOs before the event. She had read about them. She had opinions. This is sometimes used to argue she was predisposed. But many people are interested in strange topics. Interest does not equal fabrication. Barney was more skeptical at first. In some accounts, he tried to explain the light as a plane, but then he became more frightened. This difference in attitudes is part of why the case is compelling. It looks like two people moving from curiosity into fear. Now, the drive. The road goes through areas like Lancaster and Franconia Notch. There are places where the sky opens. There are places where mountains block the horizon. As they drove, the light could disappear behind terrain and reappear. This could create the feeling of pursuit. They stop, they look, they drive, they stop, they watch. Now, the critical stop. Barney gets out. He looks through binoculars. He later says he saw a large craft with windows. He later says he saw figures. He feels they are watching him. He runs back to the car. They drive away. Now, the sound. The sound could be interpreted as a warning, or it could be a road vibration, or it could be the car. But the Hills associated it with the event. After the sound, their memory becomes unclear. Then they are home. Now, the next morning. Betty notices her dress is torn in some accounts. Barney notices he is dirty. They find scuff marks. They feel unsettled. Betty calls the Air Force. She reports a UFO. They are advised to contact the local Air Force base. They do. An officer takes a report. In later summaries, the Air Force did not confirm anything. Now, the dreams. Betty has repeated dreams over several nights. In them, she is taken. She is examined. She talks to a leader. She is shown a map. She is returned. In many retellings, the beings look human-like. They are not classic greys. That is interesting. It suggests the image changed over time. Under hypnosis, Betty still describes beings with noses and hair in some accounts. Barney describes beings with large eyes. That difference matters. Some argue that Barney's big eye description came from a TV episode he watched around that time. There is debate about what he saw and when, but it raises the cultural influence question. Now, Dr. Simon. Simon used hypnosis not to recover alien stories, but to treat anxiety. He was cautious. He tried to reduce suggestion, but suggestion can still occur. Even the act of asking a person to recall can shape their recall. Also, Betty and Barney already believed something happened. That belief influences hypnosis. Now, what came out under hypnosis? They described being stopped on the road. They described being approached. They described being led into a craft. They described medical exams. They described needles. They described samples. They described humiliation. They described communication without spoken words. They described being returned. This is the template that later abduction stories followed. That is why this case is a cornerstone. Now we ask, why did this template resonate? One possibility is that it reflects a real phenomenon. Another is that it reflects a shared human fear, the fear of being taken, the fear of loss of control, the fear of medical violation, the fear of authorities. In the early 1960s, medical technology was advancing. The space race was active. People feared the unknown. So the story fit. Now, the Hills also reported that they later had trouble sleeping. They felt watched. They felt anxious. They felt changed. These are common trauma-like symptoms. But trauma symptoms can follow many kinds of events. A frightening misinterpretation can produce trauma symptoms. A real threat can produce trauma symptoms. So symptoms do not prove cause. Now we consider one more possibility. Could the Hills have encountered a secret military craft? In the early 1960s, the US military did test aircraft. Some aircraft could look unusual, but the Hills described hovering and silent movement. Those are harder to fit. Still, at night, sound perception can be unreliable. A plane can seem silent at distance. Also, fear can make a craft seem more exotic. So a military craft is possible, but not confirmed. Now what about the missing time? If a military craft had stopped them, there should be some record. But covert operations leave few records. Still, that is speculation. Now, we step into the part of the case that is often overlooked. After the story became famous, Betty and Barney lived with public attention. They were interviewed. They were challenged. They were praised. That social pressure can lock a narrative. Once you become known for a story, it is hard to change it. Even if you doubt parts, you may keep repeating the known version. This is not dishonesty, it is social identity. Now we try to answer the question, what is the most likely reality? A careful answer is, they likely saw something in the sky that they could not identify. They likely had a frightening experience. They likely misread time and distance due to stress and fatigue. Betty's dreams likely shaped her narrative. Hypnosis likely produced a detailed story that felt real. But the case still matters because it is a real historical event in the history of belief. It shows how personal experience, cultural context, and psychological tools can combine into a powerful story. Now, to make this episode truly feel complete. We need to slow down and walk through the strongest details, the points of confusion, and the later echoes of the case. Because the Betty and Barney Hill story is not only a claim about aliens, it is also a claim about memory. It is a claim about how people process a shock. And it is a claim about what happens when private event becomes public. So we go back to that night again, but we do it with a tighter focus. The route matters. The timing matters. The environment matters. The state of mind matters. And the parts that came later matter. The first thing to understand is that the night sky can be deceptive. A bright object in a dark sky can look closer than it is. It can look like it is moving when you are moving. If you drive toward it, it can seem to stay fixed because the object is far away. If you turn, it can appear to swing because your viewpoint swings. If you pass through trees and hills, it can vanish and return. This does not mean people are stupid. It means the brain is using limited cues. Now, in the hills account, the light does not just sit in the sky. It changes position. It appears to move down. It appears to approach. That is why it is compelling. But this is also where a normal explanation can still fit. If the bright object was a plane, then it would move. It could change direction. It could appear to come closer as it flew nearer. If it had lights, binoculars could exaggerate the impression of a structured object. And if the hills were already tense, their interpretations could lean toward threat. Now, why would they be tense? They were driving late at night. They were tired. They were in a rural area. They were in an interracial marriage in 1961. And they were far from home. You do not need to invent psychological theory to see that this could be a situation where vigilance is high. High vigilance changes perception. It makes you scan. It makes you connect patterns. It makes you interpret uncertainty as danger. Now, the binocular moment. This is where the case either becomes extraordinary or becomes a perfect demonstration of how a brain can construct certainty from weak signals. Binoculars magnify, but they also magnify noise. They magnify shimmer. They magnify glare. At night, a bright source can bloom. It can create rings. It can create faint shapes that are not real. A row of lights can become windows. A reflective surface can become a hull. A shadow can become a figure. But this does not always happen. So we cannot dismiss Barney's report with a single sentence. We have to ask what he said, when he said it, and whether those details stayed consistent. In many retellings, the most dramatic elements appear in the later, more polished versions of the story. That does not mean they are false, but it means we should treat them carefully. Now, the sound. A series of beeps, a buzzing, a repeated tone. This detail matters because it becomes the trigger that divides memory into before and after. In many reports, they said the sound happened, and then they felt as if they were suddenly farther down the road. If you want a mundane explanation, you can look at the car. Some cars produce a repeating sound when driving over certain pavement. Some roads create a tire hum. A car radio can pick up interference. A mechanical issue can create vibration. But the hills were clear that it did not feel like the car. It felt like something imposed. Now, missing time. Missing time can happen in at least 3 broad ways. One is objective. The person truly lost time due to an event, like being unconscious. One is practical. The person did not track time correctly due to stops, wrong turns, or mistaken estimates. One is psychological. The person formed weak memory during a period and later reconstructed it as blank. On long drives, the psychological version is common. People arrive and realize they cannot remember parts of the drive. This is not abnormal, but in an anxious state, it can become meaningful. It becomes a gap that demands a story. Now, when you combine a mysterious light, a threatening interpretation, a strange sound, and a memory gap, you have the ingredients for an abduction narrative. But an abduction narrative is not proof of abduction. It is proof that the mind needs to explain the gap. This is where Betty's dreams matter. Betty had repeated dreams that gave shape to the gap. She dreamed of being taken. She dreamed of a craft. She dreamed of beings. She dreamed of medical procedures. Dreams can be vivid because they are the brain rehearsing and reorganizing. A frightening event can produce repeating dreams. The dreams often include themes of control and invasion. Now, notice something subtle. In many abduction narratives, the medical examination becomes central. Why? Because medical examination is a modern form of violation that is not purely violent. It is clinical. It is cold. It is impersonal. It is exactly the kind of fear that can grow in the mid-20th century, when hospitals and science are powerful. So even if you are not abducted, the mind can choose that theme to express fear. Now, Dr. Simon. Simon did not set out to create an alien story. His job was to treat distress. He used hypnosis to reduce anxiety and to explore what the Hills thought happened. But hypnosis is a tool with a known problem. Under hypnosis, people can become more confident and more vivid. They can fill gaps. They can create scenes that feel like memory. This is why modern standards are cautious about hypnosis as memory recovery. But again, a person under hypnosis is not acting. They often believe what they are saying. So the hypnosis material is real in one sense. It is a real expression of their internal reality. The question is whether it corresponds to an external event. Now we examine the parts of the hypnosis story that later became cultural anchors. The beings. Barney described beings with large eyes. This detail is now so common, it feels like it has always existed. But in the early 1960s, it was not yet universal. So either the Hill case helped build that image, or it borrowed from earlier sources and spread it. There is a known possible source that skeptics point to, a TV episode that showed big-eyed aliens. The timeline of what Barney watched and when is debated, but the broader point is strong. Cultural images can feed dreams. They can feed hypnosis. They can feed memory. Now, the star map. In the hypnosis narrative, the star map serves an important psychological function. It makes the story feel objective. It gives the story a test. If the map can be matched to a real star system, the story feels confirmed. This is why the Zeta Reticuli match became famous. But a match is not simple. Star fields are dense. The map drawings are not precise. The choices of which points matter can change, so you can get a match by flexible fitting. This does not mean the match is meaningless, but it means it is not decisive. Now, an interesting middle position. Even if the abduction story is not literally true, the case can still contain an unusual event. The unusual event could be a real aircraft that behaved strangely, a meteor or satellite that appeared unusual, a military training exercise, a misread plane, or even a combination of normal things that became linked into one story. In many UFO reports, people see one light, then later see another, and link them into one object. The mind prefers a single cause. Now, we should also talk about the social environment. If a couple tells a strange story, how do others respond? Some people dismiss. Some people amplify. Investigators sometimes ask leading questions. Journalists sometimes dramatize. This can shape what details become prominent. Now, the Hills were not just any couple. They were involved in civil rights work. They lived in a social world where being watched by authorities was not an abstract fear. If a person already feels that society watches and judges them, the experience of being followed on a dark road can be interpreted in a more intense way. This is not a claim that their story is about racism. It is a claim that a person's life context shapes how fear is felt. Now, the case becomes public. When a case becomes public, it becomes sticky. People ask for the same details. People ask for a consistent story. The person learns which parts get attention. Over time, the story can become more polished. In that polishing, small uncertainties can become firm claims. This is a normal social process. It happens in court testimony. It happens in police interviews. It happens in personal stories. Now, if you want to know why the Hill case is still remembered, it is because it sits at the intersection of multiple forces. It has a strong narrative arc. It has a time-stamped historical moment. It has recorded hypnosis sessions. It has a star map claim. It has a married couple who appear sincere. And it happened at the exact period when modern space mythology was forming. Now we step away from the Hills for a moment and widen the lens. Abduction stories did not begin with them, but the modern template gained power after them. Later, in the 1970s and 1980s, many people reported similar experiences. Some involved missing time, some involved bedroom encounters, some involved medical exams, some involved reproductive themes. The Hill case is often treated as the first widely known version, so it functions like a seed. Now, in a careful documentary, we should ask whether any physical evidence has ever been found in any abduction case. The answer is that there are claims, but no widely accepted, independently verified physical artifact that proves abduction. That does not mean abduction is impossible. It means the evidence level is not high. So if we are ranking plausibility, the Hill case is best treated as one of the strongest subjective cases, but not a proven case. It is a case of high sincerity and high cultural impact, with low external verification. That is the honest position. Now, for many listeners, that honest position will feel unsatisfying. Some want certainty, some want debunking, but the world often gives neither. So the best ending is not a conclusion, it is a method. Now we add the part that many summaries skip, the investigation process itself. After the night drive, the Hills did not immediately become public figures. Their first moves were private and practical. They talked to each other. They tried to make sense of what they saw. Betty made phone calls. She reported the sighting through official channels. They wrote down what they remembered. This is important because it shows a pattern. Many extraordinary stories begin with ordinary actions. People do not begin by writing a book. They begin by telling a friend, calling an office, writing a letter. Betty contacted the Air Force and later made contact with people connected to UFO research groups. In that era, one of the most active civilian groups was NICAP. NICAP gathered reports and tried to evaluate them. It was not a government agency. It was a mix of serious-minded researchers and enthusiasts. Like any group of that type, it had both strengths and weaknesses. A group like NICAP can bring organization to a confusing topic. It can also create an echo chamber. It can reinforce a narrative. It can reward certain kinds of dramatic details. In the Hill case, the investigators who spoke with them early on captured parts of the story before the hypnosis narrative became dominant. Those early notes are valuable because they show what the Hills emphasized first. And what they emphasized first was the object and the drive, not the medical exam. The abduction narrative became the central story later. This ordering matters. If a person already has a detailed abduction narrative and then tells it, that is one thing. If a person first reports a strange object and missing time, and only later develops a detailed abduction narrative through dreams and hypnosis, that is another. Now we talk about the role of the book. The Hill case became famous largely because of a book published in 1966 by journalist John G. Fuller. The Interrupted Journey presented the story in a smooth narrative arc. It made the case widely known and made it emotionally vivid. A book like that can do two things at once. It can preserve a story. It can also shape the story. A narrative writer chooses details. A writer emphasizes tension. A writer builds scenes. A writer can unintentionally turn uncertain details into certain details. So when someone says, the Hill case proves abduction, we should ask a basic question. Which version of the story are they using? The earliest reports, or the later polished narrative, or the hypnosis sessions, or the book? Often people mix them without noticing. Now, the role of media. After the book, the story was adapted for television. The TV adaptation reached large audiences. For many people, the TV story became the memory of the Hill case. But a TV dramatization is not evidence. It is a cultural amplifier. This matters because once a story becomes cultural, it becomes a template. And templates change what people report. A person who sees a strange light in 1950 might say, I saw a flying saucer. A person who sees a strange light in 1975 might say, I was abducted. A person who sees a strange light in 1995 might say, they took genetic samples. A person who sees a strange light in 2015 might say, it was a drone or a secret plane. The environment of ideas changes the language of experience. Now we should not treat that as proof that the experience is fake. We should treat it as a known filter. All experiences are filtered. The question is whether any core remains stable across time and culture. In the Hill case, the core that remains stable is a night drive, a light that seemed to behave strangely, fear, and a later sense of missing time. The parts that are less stable are the details of the beings and the craft interior. That is exactly what you would expect if the core was real and the details were constructed. But it is also what you might expect if the whole thing was constructed. So we still need to weigh. Now we add another dimension that is sometimes ignored. The Hills were not identical witnesses. Betty was curious and open. Barney was cautious and skeptical. After the event, Betty's dreams were vivid. Barney's distress became physical. In the hypnosis tapes, Barney's fear is intense. That fear can be interpreted in different ways. Believers take it as proof. Skeptics take it as trauma from a frightening misinterpretation. A careful view says only this: the fear is real. Whatever the cause, the fear was not a performance. Now we talk about hypnosis as a source. Hypnosis sessions can be recorded. That seems like strong evidence. You can listen. You can hear emotion. You can hear detail, but recording does not guarantee accuracy. In fact, a recorded false memory can be more convincing than an uncertain true memory, because the mind under hypnosis can fill gaps smoothly. This is one of the tragedies of memory research. Confidence is not accuracy. Vividness is not truth. And emotion is not verification. Now, if you are listening and you still feel that the Hill case is different, you are not alone. Many people feel that way. The case has a particular weight. One reason is that it arrived early. It was not copied from later abduction trends. It helped set the trend. Another reason is that it involved a couple, two people. That feels like cross-checking. Another reason is that it left a paper trail of reports and letters. And another reason is that it has no clean debunking. There is no single piece of evidence that says, here is the plane, here is the exact object, here is the exact time, case closed. So it remains open. Now, what would make it less open? A clear reconstruction of the sky that night, with known planes and known celestial objects matched to their positions. A clear reconstruction of the route with accurate times. A clear explanation for the sound. But we do not have all of that. We have human memory. We have later narratives. And we have a lasting question. Now we should also address a suspicion some people raise. Why would aliens abduct random people? Why would they use medical exams? Why would they show a star map? These questions point to the story-like nature of the narrative. The abduction account contains elements that feel like a human story. A leader, a map, a test, a return. This can be interpreted as a sign of fabrication, or it can be interpreted as the mind translating an unknown event into familiar concepts. That translation idea is common in religion and myth. People describe angels in human forms. They describe divine messages in human language. So the same question arises. Are these stories literal, or are they translations? In this episode, we do not decide. We simply say that translation is a possible mechanism, but a possible mechanism is not evidence. Now, we can also consider a third category that is rarely discussed: a misidentified human encounter. Could the Hills have encountered ordinary people on the road and later merged that with the UFO narrative? This is not impossible, but it does not fit well with their repeated focus on the object. Still, in long nights, memory can blend. Now, we also consider the role of authority. When people contact the Air Force, they hope for confirmation. But official agencies often respond with minimal information. That can feel like a cover-up. In reality, it can also be bureaucracy, or lack of data, or a desire not to encourage UFO attention. The Hill case sits in that tension. Official response did not confirm, but it also did not settle. Now, we return to the central question. What should a careful listener believe? The most defensible belief is not that aliens abducted the Hills. The most defensible belief is that the Hills had an experience that felt extraordinary and frightening, and that their later attempts to make sense of it produced a powerful narrative. If you want to go one step further, you can say they likely saw something that was not easily identified at the time. If you want to go further still, you must accept that the evidence is mostly internal and subjective. That is the honest ladder. Now, one more detail matters. The Hills story is often summarized as if the abduction is the main event, but the abduction is the least verifiable part. The sighting and the fear are the most verifiable. because they can be compared to early statements. So if you want to treat the case as real, treat the early part as the most solid. Before we finish, we do one last careful comparison because it helps set the Hill's case into a realistic frame. There are other famous UFO cases, and they often have a different evidence profile. Some cases have multiple independent witnesses. Some cases have alleged radar data. Some cases have photographs. Most have some mix of uncertainty, retelling, and time. The Hills case is unusual because it includes a well-known missing time narrative and extensive hypnosis material. That makes it psychologically rich. It does not automatically make it physically strong. In a sense, the Hills case is like a court case where the witness is sincere, emotional, and detailed, but the physical evidence is thin. Courts do convict on testimony sometimes, but careful people still ask for corroboration. Now, what would corroboration look like here? It would look like a reliable record of their travel times that shows a clear, unexplained gap. It would look like a third party who saw the same object at the same place and time. It would look like an instrument record. It would look like a physical trace with chain of custody. We do not have those in a strong form. So the honest stance is to keep the case as influential and unresolved. Now, a listener might ask, why does this matter if we cannot prove it? It matters because the Hills case is a master example of how modern belief systems form. It also matters because it shows a truth that is easy to miss. People do not need to lie to be wrong. They can be sincere. They can suffer. They can remember vividly and still be inaccurate. That is not an insult. That is human reality. But it also means that when a person is sincere and suffering, we should not mock them. We should evaluate claims with compassion and with standards. Now we should also address one more possibility that sits between aliens and misidentification. A psychological episode triggered by stress. In rare cases, people can experience dissociation. They can experience dreamlike states. They can experience memory discontinuity. These events can happen without a person being mentally ill in any broad way. They can be situational. A long night drive, fear, social stress, and intense focus can create conditions where perception and memory become unstable. If that happened, it would explain why the Hills experienced something that felt external and invasive, and why it left deep anxiety. And it would explain why hypnosis later produced a vivid narrative. But again, we cannot prove that either. So we return to method. Now, to make this episode useful, we will finish by giving the listener a simple framework to judge similar cases. First, ask what is documented at the time. Second, ask what was added later. Third, treat hypnosis as subjective. Fourth, look for independent evidence. Fifth, consider alternative explanations. Sixth, hold uncertainty when evidence is not strong. Now we add a short guide to what not to do. Do not treat one case as a universal proof. If the Hills were abducted, that would not prove that every abduction story is true. If the Hills were not abducted, that would not prove that every UFO report is false. Reality is mixed. Some reports are misidentifications. Some are hoaxes. Some are honest mistakes. Some are unresolved because data is missing. A careful mind learns to live with mixed outcomes. Now we also talk about the difference between a UFO and an alien. A UFO is an unidentified object. It is a label for uncertainty. An alien is a specific explanation. Many people jump from UFO to alien because it is exciting, but there are other explanations. Weather, planes, satellites, optical illusions, secret technology. So the correct move is to keep the label and the explanation separate. The Hills started with a UFO report. The alien explanation grew later. That is not a judgment. It is a sequence. Now we add one more practical note. The best time to gather evidence is immediately. Write down times. Write down locations. Take photos. Note directions. Note weather. Note who else might have been on the road. In 1961, that was harder. No phones with cameras, no GPS, no easy access to flight trackers. So the Hills case exists in a time where evidence was harder to capture. That should make us slightly more forgiving of missing data, but it should not make us invent data. Now we can do one final quiet reconstruction of what might have happened if the case is mostly psychological. A couple sees a bright object. They fixate. They stop. The object seems to move. They feel chased. Fear builds. A sound occurs. They drive for a long period. Memory becomes thin. They arrive later than expected. They feel unsettled. Betty dreams. The dreams give shape to the unknown. Barney becomes anxious. Anxiety creates physical symptoms. Hypnosis gives the story detail. The story becomes public. The public story becomes the memory. That is one possible path. Now we can do one final quiet reconstruction of what might have happened if the case is partially external. A couple sees a real aircraft or object that behaves unusually. They cannot identify it. It comes closer. Barney sees structure. Fear spikes. They flee. They later cannot account for time and distance. Stress disrupts memory. Dreams and hypnosis fill the gaps. This path does not require aliens, but it does require a real trigger. Now we can do the alien reconstruction. A couple sees a craft. They are followed. They are stopped. They are taken. They are examined. They are returned. Memory is blocked. Dreams leak. Hypnosis retrieves. This path is possible, but it is the one with the least external support, so it should be held lightly. Now, we end with the case returning to quiet. Betty and Barney Hill lived their lives after this event. They remained convinced that something unusual happened. Barney especially suffered anxiety. Betty continued to talk about the case. They did not become wealthy celebrities. They became part of a story that the public could not let go. And that is the final reality of the Hill case. It is a story about a night drive and a strange light. It is a story about fear and missing time. It is a story about dreams and memory. It is a story about hypnosis and suggestion. And it is a story about how modern myths form. Myths do not always begin as lies. Often they begin as a real event that is unclear. The mind tries to explain it. The explanation becomes a story. The story is told again and again. Each retelling smooths the edges. Each retelling removes uncertainty. Each retelling adds detail that makes the story easier to remember. Over time, the story becomes stronger than the memory it came from. This is why the Hill case matters, even if you set aliens aside. It teaches a simple lesson about how to think. When you hear a claim, ask what came first. Ask what came later. Ask which parts are anchored to documents. Ask which parts are anchored to dreams. Ask which parts are anchored to hypnosis. Ask which parts are anchored to independent witnesses. And then, if you cannot decide, do not force a decision. The mind is allowed to hold an unsolved story. In fact, that may be the most honest place to leave the Hill case. A couple drove through the night. They saw a light. They felt fear. They believed time was missing. They carried the event for the rest of their lives. And the world took their story, and turned it into a template. If you believe it, you can still admit where evidence is thin. If you doubt it, you can still admit that the fear and the experience were real to them. That balance is the closest thing to truth we can offer when the record is incomplete. And if the listener wants to take one practical habit from this case into the modern world, it is this: when an event feels mysterious, do not only ask what you think it means. Ask what data could have existed. Could there have been other drivers? Could there have been weather logs? Could there have been flight paths? Could there have been radio records? Could there have been receipts or timestamps? Could there have been photographs? The more you train your mind to ask for those anchors, the less you will be pulled around by dramatic narratives. That does not kill wonder. It protects wonder. It keeps wonder attached to reality. Because some mysteries are real, but most stories become clearer when you demand the timeline first. And that is why the Betty and Barney Hill case still holds attention. It sits in the space between a simple misidentification and a full supernatural claim. It offers enough structure to feel real, and enough uncertainty to never fully settle. So it stays. It stays in books. It stays in documentaries. It stays in late-night conversations. And it stays in the private question a person asks on a dark road when a light in the sky seems to move in a way that does not make sense. In that moment, belief is not a slogan. It is a feeling. It is a guess. It is a story you reach for to make the unknown tolerable. The Hills reached for their story. The world listened. And decades later, we are still here, sorting memory from record and fear from fact, because the case is still unresolved enough to invite both doubt and wonder. If you hold it with care, it can teach you how to think, not what to think. It can also remind you that the strangest nights are not always solved. Sometimes they simply become part of a life, and once they do, they shape everything that comes after, even if no one ever finds a final answer. That is the quiet power of an unsolved night. It does not let go. It keeps returning, in memory, in dreams, and questions. This was a Quiet Archive story, where the story ends. Sleep begins.